As I sit here right now, it's Easter weekend, and so I'm choosing to dwell on the central component of why Easter is celebrated, the resurrection of Jesus. When I say Christianity is true, I'm not merely saying it's meaningful to me personally. I'm saying it accurately represents the truth about reality. And there's nothing more central to Christianity than the idea that Jesus died on the cross, removing the guilt that separated us from God by taking the punishment we deserved on himself, and was resurrected. No resurrection, no Christianity. Fortunately, though, miracles have a supernatural cause. The evidence of the effect is available for our scrutiny just as the evidence for any historical event is available to us. I used to have a hard time with all the Jesus resurrecting stuff. I never knew quite how to take it or how I was supposed to believe in it. I think when I was young, I wanted it to be true. I wanted to believe it because it sounded like a nice story, one that I would like if it were true. I always did love hearing a good tale, after all. But for the longest time, I'd never asked questions about it. I just went on living my life, only thinking about it on holidays like Easter or on Christmas or maybe the odd Sunday when I would go with my family to church casually once in the occasional while, mostly out of a feeling of obligation. It's funny how you can go your whole life hearing things about Jesus, but never really listening, never really investigating for yourself. It's funny how we can often live our whole lives staring a truth claim in the face and never even considering it, never even giving it a moment of our time to look and see if it is indeed true. Contrary to popular opinion, belief in Jesus' resurrection isn't something one has to believe in blind faith alone. One can look into the resurrection on the basis of powerful historical evidence. The resurrection is important because if Jesus has risen from the dead, then God has put his stamp of approval on everything Jesus said and did. God would agree with Jesus' ministry, right? So this means that we can put great stock into anything Jesus taught about such as his claim to be God, or the existence of angels and demons, the existence of heaven and hell, and that he himself is the only way to get to heaven. It gives good reason to believe the Bible is divinely inspired then, for Jesus himself quoted from the Old Testament and taught that it is the Word of God, and he commissioned apostles who would go on to write the New Testament. So after all, who would be in a better position to know whether or not the Old Testament is divinely inspired than God himself, right? And since God chose Matthew and Peter and Paul, etc., it makes sense to think that God put his stamp of approval on their teaching as well. So, if Jesus rose from the dead, that gives good grounds for believing in the inspiration of the Bible and for accepting what the Bible teaches. In a court of law, jurors are encouraged to make a decision in spite of deficiencies by selecting the best inference from the evidence, the explanation that best explains the facts of the case while possessing the fewest liabilities. That's kind of how it works, right? Every explanation offered for a particular set of facts has its own set of unique deficiencies. Even a true explanation will still suffer from some apparent liability. Basically, any criminal or forensic cases have always presented unanswered questions and apparent deficiencies. With that in mind, it's important to recognize the deficiency of the Christian explanation is that it requires a belief in the supernatural. For many people, this is a deal killer. This is the reason they simply cannot accept the Christian account. But we cannot begin our investigation of supernatural claims like the resurrection here by rejecting supernaturalism right from the outset. We cannot start with our conclusions predetermined. With the Christian explanation, or while the Christian explanation does present this kind of a deficiency of sorts, this liability is actually a matter of presupposition rather than any kind of evidential sufficiency. If we can overcome our bias against the supernatural, the Christian explanation is the most reasonable and suffers from actually the fewest number of explanatory liabilities. So what I'm choosing to do here is I've taken a lot of bits of my research on the subject here and collected much of it into a series of points that I'll talk about. I call this list of things all that a person needs to seriously consider to answer a very important question. Is the resurrection an actual event in history? So if you're willing to take a bit of an intellectual dive with me here, I'd like you to consider all the points I'm going to list that exist in the scholarly historical approach to Jesus' resurrection, all the things that helped me understand it more fully, helped answer all the questions that I had, and just really helped me come to a more fuller understanding of all the historical context of it and how that ultimate question can be answered. Is the resurrection an actual event in history? So the question needing to be asked is, to start with, did Jesus really die on the cross? Many first century and early second century unfriendly Roman sources and Jewish sources, we can come up with like Josephus and the Babylonian Talmud. These sources affirmed and acknowledged that Jesus was crucified and that he died. The Roman guards faced death if they allowed a prisoner to survive a crucifixion. Would they really be careless enough to remove a living person from a cross? Jesus would have to control his blood loss from the beatings, the crucifixion, and stabbing in order to survive, yet was pinned to the cross and unable to do anything that might achieve this. So Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion is multiply attested to in 7 independent documents. 4 of those are secular, 3 of them are from the New Testament. The secular sources, Josephus, Tacitus, Mara bar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata. I don't know if I pronounced those correctly. You can search them up for yourself. You can look into those further if you wish. The New Testament sources are the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John, and Paul's epistles. This makes it overwhelmingly more probable that Jesus' crucifixion is an event of history. It's statistically impossible for 7 independent sources to all make up the same story. Denial of crucifixion's historicity would entail that these 7 sources fabricated all the same lie independent of each other. So Jesus' crucifixion is attested to by sources even hostile to Christianity. Right? And so these sources would have nothing to gain by saying Jesus' crucifixion really happened if it didn't. In fact, they are ridiculing Christianity in the very same context of their passages, referring to the crucifixion of Jesus. So the historical fit makes it plausible that Jesus died by crucifixion. Secular history attests to the fact that Romans crucified people in the first century. That Jesus was crucified fits well with what we already know of first century crucifixions. So after Jesus died, next we can look at the evidence of Jesus' burial. First, the historical reliability of the story of Jesus' burial supports the empty tomb. Now, you might ask, how does the fact of Jesus' burial prove that his tomb was found empty? So, the answer is this. If the burial story is basically accurate, then the location of Jesus' tomb was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike, since both were present when Jesus was laid into the tomb. But in that case, the tomb must have been empty when the disciples began to preach that Jesus was risen. Why? First, the disciples could not have believed in Jesus' resurrection if his corpse still lay in the tomb. It would have been wildly un-Jewish, not to say stupid, to believe that a man was raised from the dead when the body was known to still be in the grave, right? Second, even if the disciples had preached Jesus' resurrection despite his occupied tomb, scarcely anybody else would have believed them, right? One of the most remarkable facts about the early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection was that it flourished in the very city that Jesus had been publicly crucified in. So long as the people of Jerusalem thought that Jesus' body was in the tomb, few would have been prepared to believe such nonsense as that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Third, even if they had so believed, the Jewish authorities would have exposed the whole affair simply by pointing to Jesus' tomb, or perhaps even exhuming the body as decisive proof that Jesus had not been raised. So to suggest, as some critics have said, that the Jewish authorities didn't take this business about Jesus being risen as anything more than a minor nuisance not worth dealing with, is fantastic and contrary to the evidence. They were deeply concerned about squelching the budding Christian movement. They would certainly have checked out the tomb. So even if the remains in the tomb were no longer recognizable, the burden of proof would have been upon anyone who said that these were not Jesus' remains. But no such dispute over the identification of the corpse ever seems to have taken place. Thus, if the story of Jesus' burial is historical, then it's a very kind of short inference to the fact of the empty tomb. So now we have to move on to address the empty tomb. We have what's called the Jerusalem factor. If Jesus' body was not absent from the tomb, the enemies of Christianity could have easily stopped the movement and stamped it out entirely by removing Jesus' body from the tomb and showing it to everyone. If they did that, Christianity would have died before it even began. It did not die back then, though. We can infer from this fact that they did not take Jesus' body out of the tomb in order to parade it down the street to prove to everyone that the resurrection claims of the disciples were false. So why did they do this? Well, most likely because Jesus' body was not even in the tomb to be taken out. So important note, Jesus' burial is reported in extremely early independent sources. So the account of Jesus' burial in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea is a part of Mark's source material for the story of Jesus' suffering and death. Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels, so this is a very early source, which most scholars think is based on eyewitness testimony. Additionally important, as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. Joseph is described as a rich man, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a sort of Jewish high court made up of 70 of the leading men of Judaism, which presided in Jerusalem. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish Sanhedrins. In Christian eyes, they had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. The sermons in Acts, for example, go so far as to say that the Jewish leaders crucified Jesus. So given Joseph's status as a Sanhedrist, Joseph is the last person that you'd expect to care properly for Jesus. Thus, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable, since it would be almost inexplicable why Christians would make up a story about a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus. So, for those and other reasons, most New Testament critics agree that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. The burial in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. But if this conclusion is correct, then it's very difficult to deny the fact of the empty tomb. There are good reasons to discern independent sources for the empty tomb in the other Gospels and in the book of Acts. Matthew is clearly working with an independent source. He includes the story of the guard at the tomb, which is unique to his gospel. Also, his comment about how the rumor that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body, quote, is still among Jews to this day, he said, shows that Matthew is responding to prior tradition. Luke also has an independent source, for he tells the story, not found in Mark, of two disciples visiting the tomb to verify the women's report that the tomb was vacant. The story can't be regarded as Luke's creation, since the incident is independently reported in John. And again, given John's independence of the other three Gospels, we have yet another independent report of the empty tomb. Finally, in the sermons in the book of Acts, we again have indirect references to the empty tomb. So the way it works is historians think that they've hit historical pay dirt when they have two independent accounts of the same event. But in the case of the empty tomb, we have no less than 6, and some of these are among the earliest materials to be found in the New Testament. Another evidence for the empty tomb is that I think Mark's story is simple and lacks legendary development. So, like the burial account, Mark's account of the empty tomb is remarkably simple and unembellished by any devices or motifs that are likely to characterize a later legendary account. For example, the resurrection itself is not witnessed or described, and there is no reflection on Jesus' triumph over sin and death, no use of divine titles, no quotations of fulfilled prophecy, no description of the risen Lord. These things we have to infer from taking in the story of the Bible as a whole. It's just very different from what you'd get from a Christian fictional creation. To appreciate how restrained Mark's narrative is, you only have to read the account in the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, which was proven to be a legendary piece written many decades after Jesus' life, so is not taken as a real gospel, because that is how legends look. They're colored by seeming more like fiction or like a folk tale. By contrast, Mark's account is very stark in its simplicity. So all 4 Gospels also feature women as witnesses to the empty tomb. In order to grasp this point, we need to understand some things about the place of women in Jewish society. Women were considered second-class citizens back then, and their testimony was considered worthless. They were not regarded as credible witnesses. The empty tomb narrative is most likely historical because it would have been awkward for the early church to have women as the chief witnesses when their testimony wasn't considered valid back then. They would have made males the first ones on the scene if they were just conjuring up this narrative. If one were to invent a story, the last people one would place as the first witnesses would have been women, unless it were otherwise true. So, by what is called the principle of embarrassment, we know that the tomb of Jesus was empty. The enemies of Christianity even claim that the disciples stole the body, but that presupposes an empty tomb. Even though our knowledge of this claim comes from Matthew 28, we can still count this as enemy attestation. Matthew said they were spreading the story, which means if Matthew said the Pharisees were saying this when they really weren't, he would be easily found out by those alive, right? Matthew wouldn't open himself up to such easy falsification. That wouldn't make sense. Secondly, people don't usually respond to accusations unless someone actually made that accusation of them. For example, you wouldn't deny stealing your friend's car unless he accused you of stealing it first. Finally, the earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection presupposes an empty tomb as well. In Matthew's Gospel, we find an attempt to refute the earliest Jewish response to the Christian proclamation of the resurrection. So in Matthew 28:11-15, he writes, "While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day." Now, the interest isn't so much in Matthew's story of the guards at the tomb, as in his little kind of incidental remark at the end there, where he says, "This story has been spread among the Jews to this day." This remark reveals that the author was concerned to refute a widespread Jewish explanation of the resurrection. Now, what were unbelieving Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation that Jesus was risen? That Jesus' body still lay in the tomb? No, they were saying the disciples stole away his body. Think about that. The disciples stole away his body. The Jewish authorities did not deny the empty tomb, but instead entangled themselves in a hopeless series of absurdities trying to explain it away. In other words, the Jewish claim that the disciples had stolen the body presupposes that the body was missing. Let's move on to the appearances of Jesus post-resurrection. So we have Paul's list of appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, which gives us powerful reason to believe these appearances occurred. Paul citing as early creed that he himself received. We know this is a creed because he says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." So this is ancient rabbinic language employed whenever oral tradition was being passed on. Plus, Paul's word usage in verses 3-8 is foreign to Paul in the rest of his epistles. Paul most likely got the creed from Peter and James during his fact-finding mission that he recounts in Galatians 1, which would mean this creed goes back to eyewitnesses of the resurrection. That this is when Paul received this creed is plausible from the fact that Peter and James are two individuals explicitly named, plus Paul's use of the word historiasi, if I pronounce that right, which indicates they were talking about recent events. Therefore, the creed goes back to within only a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. This list of appearances is so early that anyone skeptical about them could question the witnesses to see if the creed were accurate. If these people did not see Jesus as the creed claims, then the cat would be out of the bag, and Christianity would be discredited. Many scholars have noted that Paul's mentioning of many of the witnesses still being alive is most likely a challenge from Paul to question these witnesses. As if Paul were essentially saying, "Don't believe me? Well, go talk to them yourselves. Go ask them." In Paul's list of eyewitnesses, first, we have an appearance to Peter, is what he lists first. We have no specific story in the Gospels telling of Jesus' appearance to Peter, but the appearance mentioned here, quoted by Paul, which originated in the Jerusalem church, and it's vouched for by the Apostle Paul himself. As we know from Galatians 1, Paul spent about 2 weeks with Peter in Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion on the Damascus road. So Paul knew personally whether Peter claimed to have had such an experience or not. In addition to this, the appearance to Peter is found in Luke 24, where it says, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." That Luke is passing on a prior tradition here is evident from the awkward way it's kind of inserted into his story of the appearance to the Emmaus disciples. So although we have no story of the appearance itself, it is still quite well-founded historically. Second, on that list was the appearance to the 12. Undoubtedly, the group referred here is that original group of 12 disciples who had been chosen by Jesus during his ministry, minus, of course, Judas. This is the best attested resurrection appearance of Jesus. Paul himself had contact with the members of the 12. Also, we have independent sources of this appearance in Luke 24 and John 20. Undoubtedly, the most notable feature of these appearance stories is the physical demonstration of Jesus showing his wounds and even eating before the disciples. The purpose of the physical demonstrations is to show two things. First, that Jesus was raised physically, and second, that he was the same Jesus who had been crucified. Third, we have the appearance to 500 brethren. This appearance comes as somewhat of a shock. 500 people. I mean, this is surprising too, since we have no mention whatsoever of this appearance elsewhere in the New Testament. This might make us rather skeptical about this appearance, but Paul himself apparently had personal contact with these people, since he knew that some of them had died. This is seen in his comment, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So why does Paul add that remark? There can hardly be any purpose mentioning the fact that most of the 500 people are still alive, unless Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are there to be questioned. Notice, Paul could never have said this if the event had not occurred. I mean, he would not have challenged people to talk to the witnesses if the event had never taken place and there were no witnesses. But evidently there were witnesses to this event, and Paul knew that some of them had died in the meantime. Also, this appearance is probably not related to the Gospels, which is why it's not found in them, because it probably took place in Galilee, actually. As one kind of pieces together the various resurrection appearances in the Gospels, it seems they occurred kind of first in Jerusalem, then in Galilee, and then in Jerusalem again. The appearances to the 500 would have to be probably out in some Galilean village. In Galilee, thousands had gathered to hear Jesus teach during his ministry, and so since the Gospels kind of focus their attention on the appearances in Jerusalem, we don't have any story of this appearance to the 500 other than when Paul mentions it. So fourth, we have his appearance to James. The next appearance here with James is one of the more amazing of all, really. Jesus appeared to his younger half-brother, James. Jesus had a half-brother who did not believe that he was God incarnate or the Messiah during Jesus' lifetime. What makes this amazing is that apparently neither James nor any of Jesus' younger half-brothers believed in Jesus during his lifetime. This is multiply attested to in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark, who both attest to James's skepticism, so very unlikely that they both fabricated the same lie independent of each other. They didn't believe he was the Messiah or a prophet or anybody special, really. But after the resurrection, Jesus' brothers show up in the Christian fellowship in the upper room in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 1. There's no further mention of them until Acts 12, the story of Peter's deliverance from prison. What are Peter's first words? He says, "Report this to James." In Galatians 1, Paul tells of his 2-week visit to Jerusalem about 3 years after the Damascus Road appearance. He says that besides Peter, he saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Paul at least implies that James was now being regarded as an apostle. When Paul visited Jerusalem again 14 years later, he says there were 3 pillars. Pillars is the word he uses of the church in Jerusalem: Peter, John, and James. Finally, in Acts 21, James is the sole head of the Jerusalem church and of the council of elders. We hear no more about James in the New Testament, but actually from Josephus, the Jewish historian, in a non-biblical account, we learn that James was stoned to death illegally by the Sanhedrin sometime after 60 AD. So we have another case of a principle of embarrassment. It casts Jesus in a bad light, given the stigma back then of any rabbi whose family opposed his teaching. It casts James in a bad light as well, particularly because in John 7, James and Jesus' other brothers are trying to goad him into a death trap by showing himself publicly at a feast when they were well aware that the Jewish authorities were seeking to kill him. So why would John paint James and Jesus' other brothers in such a bad light if this is not what actually happened? Right? A short time after Jesus' death, James came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. And James was martyred for his Christian faith. Not only James, but also Jesus' other brothers became believers and were active in Christian preaching. Now, how is this to be explained? The most likely explanation for why James went from being a skeptic to being a believer virtually overnight is because the risen Jesus appeared to him, as 1 Corinthians 15:7 says. You know, if you have a brother, what would it take to make you believe that your brother is the Lord, so that you would die for the belief just as James did? So fifth, we have an appearance to all the apostles. This appearance, it was probably to a limited circle of Christian missionaries, somewhat wider than the 12. And sixth, we have the appearance to Saul of Tarsus, which is the final appearance that is just as amazing as the appearance to James. Saul of Tarsus was hired by the Jewish Sanhedrin to persecute Christians by beating them, throwing them into prison, stoning them to death, etc. So the principle of embarrassment kind of makes it highly likely that he was indeed a persecutor. People don't make up horrible things about themselves and usually don't admit them, even if they're true. Yet in 3 different epistles, Paul says that he was a harsh persecutor of Christians before his conversion. It's multiply attested to. Both Paul's epistles and the book of Acts say that Paul was a persecutor of the church. And Saul, which was his old name, converted to Christianity all of a sudden and became an active evangelist who suffered for his faith. Paul attests to his own suffering for the sake of the gospel in his epistles. The book of Acts also records some of that. The early church fathers, Polycarp, Tertullian, Clement of Rome, and several others record the account of Paul's martyrdom under the Emperor Nero. These are men who were essentially disciples of the disciples and came after them. So these are post-biblical sources even. Saul, who later became known as Paul, claimed that he went from being a Christian destroyer to being a Christian maker because the risen Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. This is the most reasonable explanation for why he went from being someone who killed Christians to being a Christian himself virtually overnight. This event changed Saul's whole life. He was a rabbi, a Pharisee, a respected Jewish leader. He hated the Christian heresy and did everything in his power to stamp it out. He tells us that he was even responsible for the execution of Christian believers. Then suddenly, he gave up everything. He left his position as a respected Jewish leader and became a Christian missionary. He entered a life of poverty, labor, and suffering. He was whipped, beaten, stoned, and left for dead, shipwrecked multiple times, in constant danger, deprivation, and anxiety. Finally, he made the ultimate sacrifice and was martyred for his faith at Rome. And it was all because on that day outside Damascus, he saw Jesus. So we have a huge question when it comes to the disciples and their willingness to die for what was known. Many people will die for what they believe to be true, but no one will die for something they erroneously invented. The disciples knew if they were telling the truth. They knew. Yet one finds that the disciples were willing to die for what they knew to be true. Stephen died by stoning in Acts 7. James of Zebedee died by the sword at the hands of Herod in Acts 12. James, the brother of Jesus, died, and Peter and Paul died at the hands of Nero. A large fact to be explained is the very origin of the Christian faith. We all know when Christianity kind of sprang into being, but why did it come into existence? What caused this movement to begin? Even skeptical scholars recognize that the Christian faith owes its origin to the belief of the earliest disciples that God had raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. In fact, they pinned nearly everything on that. To take just one example, their belief that Jesus was the Messiah. Jews had no conception of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. The Messiah was supposed to be a triumphant figure who would command the respect of Jew and Gentile alike, and who would establish the throne of David in Jerusalem. A Messiah who failed to deliver this and failed to reign, or who was instead defeated, humiliated, and slain by his enemies, is a contradiction in terms to them. Nowhere do Jewish texts speak of such a Messiah. Therefore, it's difficult to overemphasize what a disaster that crucifixion was for the disciples' faith. Jesus' death at the cross kind of spelled the humiliating end for any hopes that they had that he was the Messiah. But the belief in the resurrection reversed the catastrophe of the crucifixion. Because God had raised Jesus from the dead, he was seen to be the Messiah after all. So thus, the origin of Christianity hinges on the belief of the earliest disciples that God had raised Jesus from the dead. But the question is, how does one explain the origin of that belief? Even the most skeptical critic must put forward some mysterious X moment or thing to get the movement going. But what was that X factor? So, why is there a missing motive? When a conspiracy is formed, there's three motivating factors behind such a move. There's power, greed, and or lust. The disciples would hold no power behind holding or claiming that the resurrection was history. They were running around while often being threatened by the Jewish and Roman authorities. So as far as greed, they taught that one should not desire earthly possessions, but spiritual ones. And lust was not a factor either. They taught celibacy before marriage and marital fidelity after marriage. So in fact, the disciples had no theological motivation behind claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, as they were anticipating a military hero and a final resurrection would happen at the end of time. What motivating factors existed for these disciples to invent such a story? Well, none. The only reason the disciples taught the resurrection of Jesus was because Jesus' resurrection had occurred. And so finally, the disciples experienced something. You must agree that the disciples experienced something. Whatever that something was, it changed them from a group of people who deserted Jesus and began to disperse after his death to eventually bold proclaimers of his resurrection. So what happened to change their minds? They claimed it was seeing the resurrected Jesus. Were they trying to perpetrate a hoax? This is extremely unlikely, for nobody would go through torture and death, as most of them did, for something they knew to be a lie. So the disciples were convinced. Were they fooled by someone or something? Or did Jesus actually rise from the dead?